government's commitment in military terms to the operation in the Strait of Hormuz. For reaction, we're joined by the Greens leader, Richard Di Natale. Senator, thanks so much for your time. First of all, your general thoughts on the fact that the Prime Minister has said that there will be a surveillance plane committed for 1 month before the end of the year and then a frigate for 6 months at the start of next.
Well, it's a grave mistake, and it shows we've learnt nothing from the tragedy, the catastrophe that was the invasion of Iraq. What it shows is that it's long overdue that Australia recognises its role as an independent nation, as a nation that makes decisions based on our national interest, based on the interests of global peace and security, not following a dangerous and unhinged president in Donald Trump, not following a cabinet full of warmongers, into a conflict that risks escalating severely, into a conflict that was provoked by the US themselves by withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. This has the potential to spill Australian blood, to cost lives, to create turmoil, a conflict. We're now talking about nuclear-armed states. And what we need now are cool heads. We need diplomacy. We need to get back to the table. Australia should make it very clear to Donald Trump that it will take no part in this folly, and instead it will urge diplomacy and again to get back to the table on a deal that looks to limit nuclear capacity within Iran.
But isn't it too simplistic to suggest this is simply jumping in with the Americans when there is also a British operation in the same region? The British have the same concerns about freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. This is joining like-minded nations, isn't it, in terms of protecting that right of freedom of navigation, which is so important to us as an island trading nation?
Well, that's what happened with the invasion of Iraq. And look how that went. No, this is about Australia doing the bidding of the US. This is about Australia blindly, unquestioningly, unthinkingly following the US into another blunder. This is a dangerous administration that is taking us closer to war, and our responsibility as a partner should be to take a stand against that and make it very clear that this is a potential catastrophe. We've already heard the Prime Minister say that this could go beyond the 6 months. Initially, we had the Defence Minister come out and say this would be a limited role for 6 months. Within a few hours, we had the Prime Minister contradicting that. We know how these things go. This is how they start. It won't take long for the mission to be expanded, to be extended. We're risking provoking further conflict. This takes us closer to war, and it is something that was triggered by the US in overturning what was a very significant achievement under the Obama administration to bring Iran into a deal that seeks to limit its nuclear capacity. What we risk doing here is another catastrophe in the Middle East. And just because the UK are involved, that's no reason for Australia to be involved. We had the war in Iraq based on a lie, a confection, spruiked by the US and the UK, and Australia again followed blindly. This is a catastrophe. It's why we need to have war powers debated in our parliament. Decisions like this should be made by the Australian Parliament, not by a Prime Minister who wants to help his mate in Donald Trump look good a year out from an election.
But to suggest this is all diving in, again, I say to you with the Americans, isn't that a misread of this when it's a separate... Well, if we discuss this international construct, as it's called, it's separate simply to the US Operation Sentinel. The UK has its Operation Kipion. They're separate entities. We have our own contribution. Didn't the Prime Minister make it clear that this is about freedom of navigation as opposed to backing Trump's withdrawal of any deal with Iran, and which is seen by many as a mistake, but this is dealing with the reality now?
Kieran, the reality is Australia says jump and we say, America says jump and we say how high. And we're behaving like a lapdog to the Americans. This is an unhinged, dangerous American president who is going to take our nation into a conflict that risks escalating, and we have no role to play in that. It's not in Australia's national interest. It's not in the interests of furthering peace and security across the world. This is more US military adventurism by Donald Trump a year out from an election, who wants to beat his chest and show the American people that he's a strong leader. That's what this is about. This was a conflict provoked by the Americans, by Donald Trump, and now we're going to send troops, risk spilling Australian blood, escalate this conflict because we're in a relationship with the US that is one way. Now, Kieran, what Australia should do is grow up. The Australian government is taking us to the brink of war when what we should be doing is saying we are a strong, independent nation. We stand on our own 2 feet. We make decisions based on our interests, not in the interests of an unhinged American president. And we ensure that those interests advance the cause of peace across the world. And this does none of those things.
Senator, you obviously, very critical of this decision, but what can you do, what will you do to try and ensure that this commitment will end when the Prime Minister said it will, i.e. the plane there for 1 month, the surveillance aircraft, the frigate there for 6 months at the start of next year?
Well, Kieran, you know that mission creep is always part of these operations, and as I said, the Prime Minister's already said that the commitment won't be limited to those 6 months if the Americans ask us to extend it. The reality is that we need legislation in our parliament that means these issues are debated and voted on in the parliament. So we're going to reintroduce our bill for war powers legislation that would allow the parliament to decide whether a mission like this gets off the ground, and indeed we could recall those troops. And we call on Labor and the crossbench to back those calls. This relationship with the US is no longer in Australia's interests. It is making Australia it puts us at greater risk. It makes the world a more dangerous place. And again, I'll just say this, we need to stand up on our own 2 feet. We're a strong, proud, independent nation. We should make our decisions independently of the US. We should make them in what is our national interest, and we should always be ensuring that we advance the cause of peace and security across the world. Now's the time for diplomacy, not to support the hotheads, the warmongers inside the US administration.
To some other matters now, and this natural disaster in the Amazon that we're seeing. The rainforest has been burning for 3 weeks straight. Many observers are blaming the president there for encouraging logging and land clearing and fires. What should the Australian government do in order to try and make its views known on what is seen as a calamity, a natural calamity with that rainforest, as I say, burning for 3 weeks, the most pristine rainforest in the world?
Well, it's an environmental catastrophe, and we risk losing some of the most incredible biodiversity anywhere on Earth. But let's not forget that one of the major contributors to wildfires is climate change. And if Australia was to do anything to improve the situation in the Amazon, and indeed a threatened species right across the world, it would be to get serious on climate change. And that means having a plan to transition out of coal. We hear today that we've got risks of serious blackouts because our ageing coal-fired power generators, the old clunkers, are on their way out. We're in the midst of an energy crisis here because we've seen the national government vacate the space, more intent on running a culture war than actually dealing with the energy crisis. We've seen an investment freeze because of the government's pig-headedness when it comes to making the transition away from coal to renewables. And as a result, we're not seeing enough renewable generation. We're not seeing the storage that's necessary to transition our energy system from one that's got more in common with post-war Russia to an energy system that's fit for purpose in a modern 21st century economy.
But in terms of, one of the most important carbon sinks in that context is this rainforest in Brazil.
Absolutely.
Would you like to see sanctions or some other move by our government against that government of Brazil and the president, who many are blaming for this?
I think all options should be on the table. But again, Australia doesn't have any moral authority to lecture other nations about land clearing and about wildfires while it continues to clear up huge swathes of native forests, while we've got land clearing laws like we have in Queensland, and while we have a national government intent on propping up polluting coal-fired power at the expense of clean, jobs-rich renewable energy. We don't have a leg to stand on. And we are international pariahs when it comes to our treatment of the environment and climate change. That's why Australia needs to lead by example. That means transitioning away from coal to renewables, and it means better protection for our own environment here in Australia.
The global engineering firm Oricon has severed ties with Adani. The Minister for Resources says that company should be upfront about why they're doing it, and that being the pressure from agitators, from protest groups. Is that something that you know, obviously you support their move, you'd endorse their move, but should they at least be honest about it?
Well, it's a business decision, isn't it? And it clearly shows that they don't see a long-term future for coal as part of their business going forward. Like, the bottom line is coal's, the industry's in structural decline. We know that the rest of the world is moving and moving fast. We've seen big companies, BHP, Glencore, we've seen big institutional investors, some of the banks, Commonwealth Bank, etc., all recognising that there's huge risk in investing in coal-fired power generation, and so they're moving away from that. And you know, Matt Canavan, who is the biggest spruiker possible for the coal industry, and let's not forget, massive donations flowing in from big coal into the National Party, into the Liberal Party, indeed into the Labor Party, and they continue to back an industry that's on the way out. As a result, what have we got? We've got an energy crisis in this country. So what we should be doing is setting ourselves up for the future. We've got 180,000 new jobs created if we transition away from coal to renewables, invest in the grid, get storage targets off the ground. They're the sort of things that we need to do to get our economy fit for purpose, rather than backing an industry, as Matt Canavan wants to do, that might line the pockets of the National Party, but does nothing to ensure that we've got jobs and investment, that we can keep the lights on, that reliability continues to improve, we bring prices down, all those things that will happen, and of course, most importantly, bring emissions down if we transition from coal to renewables. That's where the market's going. The government is steadfastly refusing to acknowledge that this is a business reality.